Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to this week's installment of the Texas Public Policy Foundation Policy Livestream. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts. I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And since this very strange era began several months ago, we decided at the foundation that we would host this Monday conversation. As you know, if you've been tuning in, we've covered everything from assessing health risks to looking at the economic recovery to healthcare to education reform. And it's obvious if, in fact, this weekly event is going to be an event that spurs conversation about the pressing issue of the day, that we do what we do today in typical TPPF style, which is to take on the hardest issue facing us as Americans and Texans. And that is this twinned issue of complaints about continued racism in the country and continued complaints about excessive police force. You know, if you're familiar with TPPF, we always say that we're going to tell the truth no matter how beautiful it is or how ugly it is. And today we have both the privilege and the challenge of telling the truth about this country. But let me be really clear. The truth about this country is beautiful. It's positive. Its past, its present, its future are all things every American should be proud of. To say that is sort of like the attitude we might have to one of our children or one of our siblings, which is that we understand their imperfections, just as each of us has imperfections, but we also know they are worth loving. And if we accomplish anything in today's hour, we hope that it will spur a conversation that's national. We hope that, in fact, in some small way, perhaps even some big way, the conversation that the three of us have today, based on our experiences, based on our work as policy leaders in the United States, will lead this country to a summer of healing. And the reason we're framing it that way is because our lives as Americans, every single American life, all of those lives are worth flourishing. It's crucial that we confront these challenges head on, and it's crucial that by doing so, we're not going to let the radicals who want to co-opt a legitimate policy conversation about race relations, about law enforcement, into something that fits their agenda. Let me also be clear that the agenda of the left is to totally refashion this country into something it was never designed to be. And none of us, not even those people who are protesting, tearing down statues, stomping and burning the American flag, would want to live in the country that they're trying to design. With those caveats out of the way, I think what that does is give us the opportunity to have an open and wide-ranging conversation. And you're in for a real treat today. If you're like me, over the last couple of weeks, your emotions have ranged from everything from outright frustration to concern about some of the legitimate complaints that have been made about all of these related issues, to today sort of this resignation that is this summer of 2020 going to be filled with protests and riots and divisiveness? You know, this is a country where, thank God, we're able to air our differences of opinion. But it seems increasingly those of us who want to have a responsible conversation about these issues, those of us who want to have real discourse where we analyze and diagnose, and most importantly, actually talk about solutions, are almost silenced from airing anything that is not the official line of those folks who are the most radical. And so you're in for a treat today, because my two colleagues from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Richard Johnson and Randy Peterson, have between them decades of experience confronting these issues. And in their leadership roles at the foundation today, they are vital, not just to what we do at the foundation, but increasingly to Texas and to the nation. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleagues and friends. First, Richard Johnson comes from his native Houston, Texas, although I'm happy to say he shares some Louisiana roots with me as well. Richard heads up our Booker T. Washington initiative, is a long time public servant as well, having been chief of staff to two different members of the Texas House, and actually has a biography, just as my other colleague Randy does, that would take too long to get into detail with. Joining Richard is Randy Peterson, who's our senior researcher at TPPF, focused on policing. Randy himself, a veteran police officer, someone who continues to train law enforcement officials And I think you're going to understand as the three of us have this conversation about what's going on in this country, that 55 minutes from now, when we conclude this talk, conclude this conversation, that perhaps you're just a little more optimistic, maybe even a lot more optimistic about Americans' ability to have productive, fruitful conversations. Richard and Randy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. So those of you who joined these live streams know that for about half an hour, Richard and Randy and I will talk. I'll ask perhaps some smart questions, but I'm just going to be asking questions from the heart, from someone who has observed these problems my entire life, studied and researched them myself. But most importantly, what I hope you and the audience hear from Richard and from Randy are a couple of things. First of all, their expertise. I mean, both of these guys have lived these issues. But secondly, I hope you hear from them sort of a hopefulness that is in their being about America, about Texas, and in particular, our ability as people who look differently, who have different skin color, who have different experiences, to come together for the American Republic. It's really worth doing that. And so I thought I would start our conversation today, gentlemen, by reading a paragraph from something Richard wrote. It's in the Austin American-Statesman today. And this is what you say, Richard. Rebuilding trust will mean coming together to establish expectations of accountability. It will mean building bridges, not barricades. Our faith leaders are uniquely positioned to help us build those bridges. They can help both sides move from protest and posturing to policy, to make reforms, not merely exchange rhetoric. It's really well said, Richard, because I think we're hearing a lot of exchanging of rhetoric, much of which is really unhelpful. Before we delve into some specific diagnoses and policy solutions, I know that our audience would like to hear your perspective on sort of a 30,000-foot view of what's going on in the country right now.
Thank you so much, Kevin, because that's what I want to do. I want to give a 30,000-foot view of what's happening right now and what we're experiencing right now. One of the things, and also what's being lost in our response. You know, one of the things that we're seeing is a raw reaction to what's perceived as a crime against humanity and a separation between, you know, individuals and groups. But what we're losing here is that we are America. We are one America, and we basically are one nation, you know, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the overarching symbol that we need to actually be focused on and given a need to is God, because we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And even on our currency, we say, in God we trust, not in a party we trust, or not in Antifa we trust, but in God we trust. And I believe that once we restore our focus back on what America was built on, the foundation of America, that has made us the superpower of the world. It is our belief system in God that directs and guides our policies and the implementation of those policies. So we have to move away from the horrible raw scene that we saw in that video with Mr. Floyd. And I don't think nobody on the planet would agree that that was not a horrific incident and that incident was not wrong. But now that we move away from that and then get focused back on what America is all about, we're human beings and we're all one nation under God, and start correcting or tweaking our policies to make sure that they fix things that need to be fixed. Because at the end of the day, you, myself, Randy, and policy researchers and policymakers know that policies are forever changing. It's a fluid process. It's not a stagnant process. You don't write one law and then it stays there forever. we have to forever refine it. That's why we have different congressional sessions. That's why we have different legislative sessions in order to refine policy as time moves forward. And I think that once we, number one, refocus and understand that this is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty, meaning freedom and justice for all, we'll be back on the right track toward moving America and the world forward.
I think that's well said. And that's a theme we'll come back to in our conversation, I know, because of conversations you and Randy and I have just as co-workers. And that is, of course, the role of faith, the role of Christianity in particular in the country. But even beyond that, perhaps for audience members who are skeptical of that, keeping in mind we're in a pluralistic society, institutions that as some academic types say, mediate our relationships. They actually help us to get along better. Obviously, churches would be at the top of the list, other organizations like Rotary Club, Kiwanis, so on. The point is, a lot of those, in fact, most of them have just been decimated over the last couple of decades in terms of membership. Church attendance is down. And for those of us who fashion ourselves as social scientists studying the American Republic, we know that it's not a coincidence that we're also seeing the inability for us to have a proper, fruitful conversation about hard topics. And instead, what happens is that some of the protests, certainly not all of them, become violent, they become chaotic, they actually undermine the very argument that the protesters are purporting to make. And so I think you've laid out for us early on in our conversation some of the themes that we'll be covering. So we'll come back to you in just a minute, Richard, but want to get Randy involved in the conversation. Randy, obviously, your experience as a police veteran, your experience having been heading our police initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for a few years is just vital. And so I'm going to ask you the same question, which is sort of the 30,000 foot view of what's going on in the country right now.
Yeah, I'm glad to take it from Richard. He gave a great 30,000 foot view. I'm going to actually lower that altitude just a little bit and talk about it. I think it's important to recognize that we have seen this before and we've gotten through it. However, I don't know that we've learned anything from it, right? This has been cyclical. We can go back to 1992, the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King incident. 16 Ferguson, and then now, and obviously sporadic incidents in between there. I think though that we have to make a decision as a country to try to stop that cycle, right? We could sit this out and this will pass, right? I mean, it will pass probably in the next 12 months. If I had to take a guess, we wouldn't even be talking about it anymore, unfortunately. Or we could start now doing the hard work and look at the long term of trying not to have these kinds of incidents happen again. See, Richard pointed out that we are one nation under God. I think we're losing sight of that as a country sometimes. I think the media tries to make us lose sight of that as a country. If we look at what the police are, they are an integral part of the community. And when that starts to break, that connectedness of the police to their community, that's when we see these things happen. And understand it doesn't take a whole bunch of incidents before a community just says we're done. It can be that fraying, right? When we've separated the police from the community, of which they're supposed to be integral, it can take just one flashpoint, right? And then because there has not been the establishment of trust, the view of legitimacy, then we end up with what we had now. And unfortunately, what we have now with the 24/7 news cycle is we have a lot of people looking to get into that, and you alluded to this in your opening, Kevin, looking for their worldview to get seen rather than what the protesters are actually looking at, and that's a healing between them and their police forces that protect them. That's it. If we look at government being primarily about the protection of rights and the preservation of peace, the police are one of the only legitimate functions of government, When we lose them, right? People want that. Overwhelmingly, people want their police to protect them, to preserve their rights, to preserve peace in their communities. When we see that detachment, and we have no other institution, by the way, like this in the United States, where we have representatives that are wholly the government and wholly part of the community, and have to somehow have that duality intertwine. I mean, it's a difficult, complex job, but it's one worth doing. And I hope that we take this time to ignore the rage, right, that has been propagated by special interests, that the media has fanned the flames of, and we actually start to move forward to fix the issues that we talked about. And when we talked about one nation under God, I think it was Romans 13:4, and please forgive me if I misquote, but that God gave us governments to protect us, but that they carry the sword not in vain, right? When we get to talking about use of force, there's a legitimate place for use of force, and we're not going to be able to get away from that, but we can have serious discussions as to how to perfect that. And I think that will go towards the healing. But there's a lot of other issues, and I'm sure Richard's going to touch on them, that don't have to do with use of force and don't necessarily have to do with the police, that have caused some of this rift.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, even as we become more specific in our conversation, Randy, and thank you so much for those points, that will also become broader in a sense and looking at some larger context. For example, I think it's, again, speaking as a policy person, as a historian of race relations in this country, it's just reprehensible from the standpoint of truth that almost nowhere in these conversations are there analyses by our media of the state of the American family, whether it's a Black American family, white family, Hispanic family, yet another institution of civil society, the core institution of civil society, that would really help mitigate some of the rage, even legitimate rage about valid complaints, right? We're not even able to have those conversations like we used to. So I think y'all have started this conversation in just a very helpful way. And so I want to probe a little bit into some particular policy questions here in a moment. Before I get to that, though, I'm going to ask each of you about something that you don't talk about because you're very modest guys, and that's about some experience or two that you've had that's particularly relevant to these concerns about race relations, racism, and law enforcement. And so, Richard, I want to pivot back to you, thinking about a couple of episodes you mentioned in your op-ed in the Statesman. You can mention those or bring in some others, but obviously, as an African-American man, you have a perspective on this that's different than Randy's and mine. Doesn't mean that it's better or worse, right? We're all equal Americans in God's eyes and under the law. But I think this is a great opportunity for those of us who have not been in your shoes to hear from you. When you hear the phrase systemic racism and you believe that some of that is legitimate, explain for us what that means for you as someone who also deeply loves this country, has served this country in the U.S. Army.
I think that when we take a look at systemic racism, and try to operationalize, systemic racism, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to different people? It may take on different meanings because, if individuals go back to slavery, we take a look at slavery, and then, Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery. Booker T. Washington, I take more of a view that Mr. Washington took in terms of understanding where we are in the development of America, in the growing of humanity, and then contextualize that in today's time when we talk about, are there disparities in our communities? Absolutely, there are disparities in our communities. Is there work to be done in terms of perfecting an environment of equality? There's work to be done, but at the end of the day, should there be a certain amount of self-reliance that goes on? Should there be a certain amount of overarching focus on freedom? Absolutely. And so We achieve that by working together, not being separate and apart, and not fighting one another. Uh, are there great police officers? Absolutely. 99% of police officers are great. And you don't just have white police officers. You have a lot of black police officers. And a lot of them are my friends. I grew up with some of them. And we've had problems. I've had problems, where police stop and give you a stop, and then some of them may not have a good day, may not be having a good day. But one of the things I've been able to do is understand that through my experiences, and I can tell when you're not having a good day, I'm going to be extremely compliant. I'm probably the nicest guy in the world because I can see that this person is not having a good day. As I explained in my op-ed in the Statesman, I was pulled over one time when I was chief of staff for a city council member on my way to City Hall and asked to get out of my car and get on the ground. And I was very frustrated about that, but I could tell that the officer was agitated. And so what I did was I got out of my car and I got on the ground and I didn't say anything. I didn't, if he asked me something, it was yes, yes, officer, no, officer. But then he de-escalated because of my attitude, the way I handled the situation. And I know when people hear me say that, they think that it was a white officer. No, it wasn't. It was an Asian officer. And so basically, people have bad days, and not just bad days. Not every person should be there. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But 99% of the folks should be there, and they are doing a good job. And I've had situations in my community. I grew up in an all-black community. I was born in an African-American church. I was raised in born in African-American hospital, raised in African-American church, raised in African-American community, and have 3 degrees from historically black colleges and universities. And so I've been around the African-American community immersed my whole life. So I've seen times when violence has erupted in our community, and we were the first to call the police, and glad to see them when they got there, because they were able to bring law and order and peace back to the community and create an environment of safety. But, there's been far more times where I've seen safety be brought back to the community than I've seen incidences occur with myself associated with police officers who probably should not be there and should not have on the uniform, or police officers who are having a bad day and maybe need to see a therapist, like me.
Yeah, that's another thing you do. A great psychology background as well. Thanks, Richard, for that insight. Randy, similar question to you, especially in your days as a law enforcement officer. Surely you encountered firsthand, or maybe some of the officers who were reporting to you encountered in similar situations. What did you learn from that as a leader, and now as a policy person trying to guide not just law enforcement agencies, but now legislatures and even Congress to a better policy for policing?
Well, first, my position has always been, since starting with TPPF, and I think this is TPPF's position, that good policing policy is good for everyone, right? It doesn't affect one racial group or socioeconomic group any better or worse than any other. So perfect policy would be unachievable, but would be perfect for everyone, right? And we wouldn't have to even have the concern for racial inequality that we have. So that's kind of always been my position on it, is working towards policing policy that was going to work for everyone. And I know that later we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. But to Richard's point, talking from his experience as a member of the African American community, I'll give you just a little bit of my experience from the law enforcement community as well. And I say the law enforcement community because, unlike almost any other institution in the United States, we look at each other nearly blind, right? We look at each other as blue. That's it. If you're wearing a badge and a uniform, same as mine, it didn't matter if you were white, black, Asian, Hispanic, what your sexual preference was, if you were a man or a woman, none of that mattered to me or my colleagues. We would live or die with each other. And that was the police as an institution get this reputation for being racist, but if you look at our subculture, it's probably the least racially cognizant group of people you can find. I mean, we identify with each other at a level that is more pure. It doesn't matter the color of your skin; it matters the color of your uniform, or that you're wearing a badge. And I think a lot of times in messaging, when we call the police racist and we say, well, they're racist and they're mistreating this group or that group, part of that on a deep level is offensive to law enforcement officers individually, not as an institution. As an institution, they don't have feelings, right? But as individual officers, they look at their brothers and sisters in blue next to them that are white, black, Asian, Hispanic, anything, and they look at them as equally as close as their own family members. And then to call that person a racist and say you're a racist hurts them, right? It's offensive and it's repulsive to them. And the outcome of that, the response to that, is either they just flat out ignore you, right? So that the screaming of racism doesn't gain any traction with them because they don't even want to listen to it, or it offends them, right? And you could see why when I think it's important that the general public have this insight into the policing subculture. It's a lot of things and it's not perfect, but if it is a model for the rest of society anywhere, it's in its blindness to each other's differences. So I just thought I would point that out. I don't know that that gets enough attention, really.
Yeah, I agree entirely. So thanks for pointing it out. So y'all have set the table of kind of high level diagnosis of what we're facing as a country really well. And so let's take a few minutes to get into some of the policy objectives that each of you talks about in your respective roles at the foundation. First of all, Richard, as director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative, you've been working for the last several months with us and then for the last few decades in other roles, really on these issues of self-reliance, independence, and not just for one segment of the population, but for all of us as Texans and Americans, right? Anyone who thinks that Booker T. Washington's message is somehow exclusively for African Americans is just has misread his intentions and his substance. It's something that I teach my own kids about. We all should be doing that. And so with that context, walk us through what if you kind of had a magic wand, what are the one or two reforms that you would make, whether to policing or to some other aspect of policy that would help us solve this crisis?
The first, there are two. There are two. Number one, I think, would be education reform, and to include workforce development, skill development, and collaborations between educational institutions and industry, so that we can open the door and unleash the innovative ideas into economic development, dealing with economic disparities. So if a student is trained in a marketable skill and have the opportunity through relationships with industry to go straight from high school into industry, then that brings that person into the American dream, into view and sight of the American dream, because that person said, I can earn a certain amount of money, I can have a family, and that is the great American dream, have a home and a family. And so with that door being open through policy, that responds directly to communities, not just communities of color, but communities that are experiencing economic slowdown or economic blockages. And so that opens that door. And then once an individual is going to work, they're experiencing the American dream, they're less apt to participate in criminal behavior. So that makes the community safer. And then, that's one policy area. The second policy area that I would like to see, reform in is, police reform. And we've brought that forward, I know, in the 85th legislative session when we talked about police readiness. I served 8 years in the United States Army, so I know a lot about readiness. You have to be, physically ready, and you have to be mentally ready to go in and protect and serve the nation. And we worked together on a couple of bills. One was physical fitness and readiness, to be physically ready to engage and serve the community. And then the other side was mental health, fitness and readiness. Number one, making sure that individuals had the right physical readiness at the onset, at the beginning of coming in through the process of hiring, and then having periodic, follow-ups in terms of psychological evaluations to deal with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Because if I'm at the best of my game, health-wise, going in, I may not have seen all the things that police see on a daily basis. I may have not seen all the carnage that they see on a daily basis. And so that is going to affect me down the road. And so if we fine tune our policies to make sure that we're able to address on the front end readiness, on the front end, both physically and mental readiness on the front end, as well as maintaining physical and mental readiness throughout the careers, will serve not only the people that serve in our communities well, will serve our communities itself well.
Sure, and I appreciate all of that, Richard. In particular, you have a way of framing a response to that question where you talk about some solutions that are prevention and some solutions that are intervention. And of course, at a think tank, it should surprise no one who's in the audience. We really like the preventative measures, but it's obvious that we've also need to do some intervention, and in the best sense of that word, certainly, hopefully very little of that physical. I think there's a way we can have these conversations, especially in the policy sphere. So Randy, with that in mind, I'm giving you the magic wand for your kind of policy fantasy land. What one or two or even three reforms would be at the top of your list?
Yeah, well, I had the honor of being able to testify for the bills that, or at least one of them. We didn't have research on the other one, but we supported it, Richard. That that Richard put forward, and that really kind of tees up where we have gone at TPPF with our policing reform initiative right now, and that is in the training area. And our theory, myself and Mike Hughes, who was on contract with us, have been working with the police academy and intend to work with other police academies as to how, in order to deliver the training, test the training, and decide what that curriculum should look like for police officers. Unfortunately, right now, law enforcement training is delivered very often in just blocks of segments, right? We beat them up for a whole day on penal code, then we beat them up for another couple days on traffic code, and they get these silos, and the integration of all of this training is lost, right? Nowhere is this more dangerous though than in use of force. We spend maybe a week of training at a block of physical skills, and then tell police officers, okay, you're ready, go out on the street. Now, to put that into a sports analogy, it would be like your football coach bringing you in and saying, we're going to train super hard for 2 weeks in June, and then I'll see everybody again in November for your first game, right? But we're not going to meet between them. It makes absolutely no sense. It has not ever made any sense. Our theory, obviously, is that there's a better way to deliver that training, but also the psychology behind it. I always use the analogy that you are much more likely to be bitten by a dog that is afraid of you than you are one that's just strictly an aggressive dog. Same thing holds true with police officers. Police officers are much likely to use excessive force or no force at all, right? We've seen that tragedy happen as well. It doesn't get as much attention when they're scared than if they're just angry, right? I mean, I think some of our worst incidences of use of force that we've seen happen are from officers who are incompetent with their skills and therefore scared. And they're scared because they're incompetent, and they know that, right? But they haven't been properly trained. We can start that training in the academy. It has to continue, though, through an officer's career. But if in Texas, we're fortunate to have them for 19 weeks, which is longer than some states. And if we give them daily instruction, by the time they graduate, they should be confident and capable. That allows them to make better, more proportional use of force decisions. It doesn't truncate the use of force. If you have an officer that all they can do is shoot a gun, okay, then and every problem becomes a nail if all you have is a hammer. That's a recipe for disaster. Whereas if you have an officer who's not only been trained in the physical skills, I know I'm focusing on that right now, but there's a whole surrounding thing that has to go with that. That's de-escalation, communications, all of those things that can prevent us from even getting to a point where we have to use force. But once officers do, and they will, every officer will use force, maybe not deadly force. Most don't do that, by the way, throughout their career. But they will all use force at some point in their career, that they make a better decision on that. So that's the biggest component that kind of goes off of what Richard was talking about. But then two other things is, one is seeing departments move into a community engagement philosophy. We hear the term, we've heard it for decades, right? Community policing. And it sounds good, but it only sounds good depending on what your definition of community policing, because we don't really have one that's universal. So in one city, they may take federal grant money for community policing and they're using it to drive a SWAT team around and do drug and gun roundups, right? I guess that's community policing. I'm not sure that that's what the community was looking for out of it, but it met the standard for the grant, right? And then in another one, we have ice cream socials and things like that are super nice and they're good, but the people that show up to that tend to already support the police. So we're not really engaging the people that we're having the differences with or who are upset about what's going on. Community engagement is different. This is where the community is engaged with the police department, and ideally even higher up than that, right? Your city hall, your local legislators, and even higher maybe, to talk about what policing in that community needs to look like, because it's different in every community, and it should be. Policing is a local issue, right? We don't talk about federal policing because federal policing really doesn't exist, except maybe in like tribal lands, right? Tribal police. Mm-hmm. Everywhere else, they are strictly law enforcement officers. They enforce the laws. They don't do policing, which is, law enforcement is really a small part of policing. So each community at the local level has to determine how they want to be policed, how they should be policed, what needs do they have, what wants do they have, what are their expectations. That's the kind of engagement that we're looking for.
Well, I appreciate the thoroughness of that response, Randy, and want to pick up with that last point you made about community policing, because I know that's something you, Richard, have worked on. In fact, recently we were having a conversation about that. My specific question is, do you have examples in Texas, or for that matter, other places, of community policing that's worked well, both from the perspective of the law enforcement agency as well as from residents?
Absolutely. In Houston, Mayor Lee Brown, the first African-American mayor in Houston, the fourth largest city in America, was also previously a police chief. Mm-hmm. And a good friend of mine. I talked with him a day or so ago about everything that's going on here. And one of the things that we talked about was his community policing model. And there's a specific component to that, which I see actually engaged even now in Houston. A lot of people say, well, hey, man, George Floyd grew up here in Houston, but I don't see people in Houston burning down buildings and doing a lot of rioting and looting, that sort of thing, simply because there are remnants of that community policing model that Mayor Brown put in place that still exists today. One important component of that is the Mayor's Ministerial Alliance Group, or Ministers Against Crime. And they still meet. And as a matter of fact, when everything happened with Mr. Floyd, I could see some of them posting on Facebook messages out into the community. And you saw a more calming effect happen, a calming response happen in Houston than you saw in Seattle, New York, LA, and other places, because of that community policing model and the ministers in the community that are directly associated with the mayor's office and also directly associated with Houston Police Department also joined in and said, hey, let's all get together and respond to this appropriately. And you've seen a different response come out of Houston than you've seen come out of certain other areas like New York. And Houston is a major metropolitan city. So I think that when you bring the ministers in who are influencers in the Black community, whether people want to acknowledge that or not, it's a real fact that most African Americans who are associated with church, which is like 99% in some shape, form, or fashion, are going to listen to their pastor. And so when you have the pastors come into play and join hands and have members of HPD come over to the church, and you have the mayor involved, now you have the total community involved in public safety. And I think if we're able to mimic that model across the country, we'd see a different response. But as to Randy's point, we don't appear to have a national standard when it comes to community policing. And so that's what we have in Houston that has been effective, because I looked around and I said, well, hey, George Floyd is right here from 3rd Ward in Houston, but none of the people in Houston are burning down 3rd Ward. None of the buildings are going down. We're not attacking the police. And so immediately I looked at that component and I saw that component in action, but you won't see that on CNN. And you won't see that on MSNBC or any of the major networks, but that is what's brought the common effect in the response to what's going on right now in Houston.
Thanks, Richard. And Randy, I'll ask you a follow-up question along the same lines, but just cue our audience at this point. If you have any questions, you can put those in the comments box on whatever social media channel you're viewing this. So Randy, this will be sort of a two-part question. The first is, what are the best examples from your experience, both as a police officer as well as a researcher, of community policing?
Well, I think that I could give you an anecdotal story, which maybe if we got a couple minutes, I will. But before
Sure.
that, I think that the two things that we did. So I worked in a nice community, and we had pretty good support from the community. And I remember early on, we started doing this thing, which was called the Citizens Police Academy. And it was, I think, 12 weeks long. They would come in, meet for a day, a week, one night they'd spend 3 hours or whatever with the police officers. And so they had asked me, would you come in and teach one segment? I think it was about gang crimes. And I said, okay, I didn't really know anything about this. I was a detective. We'd been doing this forever, but it was kind of siloed into one part of the department that did it. And I thought, I don't know, are these people are they vigilantes that want to learn police tactics? What group are we going to have here? And I went in and I walked away from that meeting, right? The 3 hours I spent there with them, amazed at how involved people wanted to be with learning about their police department. It was so neat. They asked all kinds of questions. They had, they had great questions. They wanted to hear stories. They wanted to know what we do, how we do it, why we do it. And I thought to myself, everybody in the city should go to this, right? Because they're learning so much about their police officers. Not only that, but they're meeting their police officers, right? Some of these people have never met a police officer from the department that works for them. They just haven't had any police contact. So they're meeting their police officers. They're engaging with them. I thought it was a neat program. I'm not saying that this is the model for all of community engagement, but it opened my eyes to what community engagement looked like at a really deep level when you got that involved with. It would be a small group, maybe 15 participants at a time, every time they would run it. But it was 15 people then that went out and told their neighbors how great the police department was and how much they learned, and also gave us feedback, right? About, well, this time, if they did have police contact, this happened, why would that happen? So it really gave them an opportunity to engage. And I thought that was great.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll pick up on that in several moments when I come back to you for closing comments. But first, we do have some time for some audience questions. And the first one, which can go to both of you, but we'll start with you, Richard, is a question basically about the rule of law. That is, even if someone is willing to acknowledge that America is imperfect, that all of us have the opportunity to be better, either personally or professionally. What can we do, this audience member is asking, to help build a better culture of the rule of law among all of us?
I think we have to understand that we all are imperfect and we're all working on perfecting humanity. And in that work to perfect humanity, we have to look at the rule of law and engage the rule of law through policy, policy perfection. Like if I have a car that's my car, it's a nice car, and but every now and then there's some small things that go on wrong with my car. So I take it to the mechanic, then I have it analyzed and diagnosed, and then the mechanic say, okay, if we change this screw here and we tweak this there, everything will be okay. And so we do the same thing with the rule of law. We constantly examine it, and we have to tweak it here and tweak it there, because when times change, circumstances change, environments change, and so we have to constantly perfect our rule of law, and we do that through policy. So get engaged. My advice would be to get engaged with your policymakers, get engaged with think tanks like the Texas Public Policy Foundation, so that we can begin to get your input, because that tells us what we're listening to. When you go to the doctor, you say, tell me a little bit about it. And so you're right there, boots on the ground. Tell us a little bit about it. Let's work together and tweak the laws and perfect humanity.
Yeah, good answer. So Randy, I'd love to hear your response to that as well, but with limited time, I want to get to a couple of policing specific questions for you. So the first is from one of our audience members: should we abolish qualified immunity? And you might start by explaining what that is, because a lot of our audience members, who of course much smarter than I am, may not know exactly what that phrase means.
Right, and if you're not an attorney, which I am not, it's a difficult concept to wrap our heads around, but it's basically a judicial doctrine, not a statute, that provides government officials, not just police officers, with immunity from litigation for certain actions taken in the line of their official actions, right? So that's the kind of sums it up a little bit with that. So the question has been coming up for the last, I guess, the last several weeks about, should we get rid of qualified immunity for police officers, make them personally liable for violations of the Constitution? And we are working on modifications with our Center for American Freedom, our attorneys at TPPF, to try and come up with a workable model that would get rid of the worst instances of qualified immunity protecting an officer that shouldn't be protected, but also protect those officers that are going out there and doing their job every day. Understand that if we get rid of immunity completely, right, a police officer would be liable for a constitutional violation every time you were found not guilty on a traffic ticket or anything like that. So the result would be police would either cease to exist, because no one would do that job with that kind of risk, or they would not do anything, right? You would never put handcuffs on one person if a not guilty verdict meant you were going to lose your house. So so there has to be some sort of protections in there, but how those look, we're obviously looking at how we would do that.
Sure. So people interested in that can keep track of what we're doing with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and in particular you. Follow-up question, somewhat related, but a distinct question, and that is, what's the role of police unions in this disintegration, if you will, of good relationship across law enforcement agencies with communities, and even, for that matter, municipal governments?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk all day. We could do a whole separate one on the issue of police unions or public sector unions in general. The idea of them being able to bargain against the interests of their community seems offensive to us at Texas Public Policy Foundation, probably. I'm not going to speak for
not probably, it does. Yes, it does.
So we there's a lot we could talk about, but to address the point specifically, where it becomes an issue in this circle, right? In this space that we're talking about, is that the unions tend to reflexively protect police officers from not only termination, but also from discipline. Now, there's good reasons for that, right? It does insulate officers from being used as political pawns. You don't want to make an example of a police officer just so a city doesn't burn down if the officer was actually right? If they were doing what they had to do, that wouldn't be fair either. That's the idea, that unions would protect those individuals, but in application, they protect every officer, good or bad. And what that does then is you have the head of the law enforcement agency, the chief of police or what have you, has a vision about what their agency should look like, right? But they can't carry out that vision if they can't get rid of bad officers through termination, but more importantly, discipline good officers, right? We discipline our children because we love them, not because we hate them. We want them to do better and improve their performance. And even that's inhibited. And that may even be more difficult for a chief to put their vision out than the actual terminations, which are indeed bad themselves.
Sure. Thank you. Richard, following up, also a question about policing for you. One of our audience members is asking you to say a little more about the distinction between policing and law enforcement.
Policing, there's when you're policing, it's more of a community working together towards safety. Police making sure that things are are being addressed in the community, and making sure that the rule of law is intact and it's not being violated. Law enforcement is more of an enforcing tactic. Is things that have gone on and they have to enforce the law. But policing is more of a collaborative effort. That's why I praise community policing so much, because it's a comprehensive approach to public safety, and where you're bringing in all of the different groups, including the community, into the process. Law enforcement is a situation when folks come in, they have to enforce the law. And we do have laws on the books that must be enforced. But when we're talking about policing, we're all fluid. We're all working together from a comprehensive perspective.
Sure.
And I think that's more helpful.
I think that's a helpful distinction, and not to get too academic or philosophical about it, but when we hear the phrase rule of law, sometimes all of us in the United States think about law enforcement in the way that you described it. In reality, the way it's worked, when it's worked really well, is along the lines of how you describe policing, which is that we all believe in the rule of law, not because we're going to get in trouble if we violate it, but because we actually flourish. We ironically have more freedom when we are partners in establishing that rule of law. And I think that's what's so troubling to many Americans, who the vast, vast, vast majority of whom are not racist. They believe that everyone, of course, is equal. The vast, vast, vast majority of people are not going to go out and topple statues and set fire to buildings. It's so doggone frustrating for all Americans, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, from any part of the world, to watch the news. And it's been so gratifying to see the two of you be so calm and substantive in your responses to these questions that really are about the pressing issues of the day. So we have just several moments. We'll begin to wrap up here, but just wanted to ask a follow-up question for you, Randy. And that is, understanding we love police officers. We love first responders. It's sort of like TPPF is in favor of education reform, not because we dislike public school teachers. We love them. They're making a great sacrifice. We are at odds often with teachers' unions because we believe, don't have the best interest of the child at heart. It seems as if there's an analog to police unions. And one audience member is asking you a tough question. Should we abolish police unions?
Oh, that's a tough question. I want to yell yes. But that's a philosophical point that is not obviously union oriented in my mind. I mean, I came from Illinois and was a member of a police union, as was almost every police officer. So, so I do understand some of the good things that they do. So, philosophically, I don't think public sector unions should exist. I don't. some of the good things, though, and I know in Texas we tend to call them associations, in that that they do provide some services and things like that for their membership. That's great. But I think if we were to go down that road, probably looking at a point where we limited, let's say, the ability of municipalities to engage in a collective bargaining agreement that went beyond the state statute, for example. In Illinois, for example, we had the Uniform Peace Officers Disciplinary Act, which was a Bill of Rights for police officers. However, your individual bargaining agreement could modify that and then superseded state law, right? State statute, which, even at being a police officer, made no sense to me. And it could be better or worse for the officer or the community, depending on how that bargaining agreement went. And I think that limiting that probably would be the best thing, short of abolishing all public sector unions, as I've said earlier.
Yeah, well said. I'll give you a virtual high five. So we have last few minutes here. You know, because you probably have watched a couple of these live streams before. I always ask our guests to leave us with some hopeful message, not to be Pollyannish, but because we ought to feel privileged, regardless of who we see in the mirror each morning when we wake up and know that we had the great privilege to wake up in the United States of America. And of course, God loves us, especially who wake up in Texas, because we got a double privilege. And so that's for all of our out-of-state friends tuning in. Richard, what hopeful message would you leave us with as we have just begun the summer of turmoil in the United States?
Martin Luther King said, "One cannot begin to live until he can rise above the narrow confinements of his own individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." We are faced in a moment where we can now rise up and deal with concerns of all humanity and move humanity toward a perfect being. This is our opportunity. This is our moment. Let's stand up and work together and make humanity great.
Yeah, amen. Thank you. I'll put in a plug, which you've not asked me to do, but because I love the work you're doing with the Booker T. Washington Initiative, and that is you've got a podcast that's starting tomorrow, I believe, and it will be not only entertaining but substantive. It will be heartfelt. And if you're in the audience and interested in that, go to texaspolicy.com/BTWI for Booker T. Washington Initiative, texaspolicy.com/BTWI. Randy Peterson, great friend and colleague, what would your hopeful message for us be?
Well, I would say first off that we will get through this. We always do. That's the hopeful part of it. But I think that I can qualify that a little bit with some evidence, right? We've been banging the drum on good conservative policing reform for years here at TPPF. I wrote the conservative case for policing reform. You can look it up on our website, texaspolicy.com, 2 years ago, right? The conservative case for policing reform 2 years ago. And now, 2 years later, after this, we're getting a lot of interest from conservatives about it, which I think is inspiring, right? Because now it's a bipartisan issue. Now we're going to have people talking about it from all angles, and we can get everything out in the open, and we can say, hey, we've already had some of these fixes. I was thinking of doing an op-ed saying, I wish you would have listened to me, but I don't know if that would have gotten through comms. So
I thought about sending out a tweet earlier linking to that wonderful report, the conservative case for police reform. I thought that'd be a little too arrogant on behalf of TPPF, but and in all seriousness, let me say, I know we have a lot of policymakers and staff of policymakers, not just in Texas, but from around the country, who have tuned into this. And in all seriousness, because at our core, we're a think tank and we want to advocate for good policies. If you're interested in having conversations about the conservative case for police reform in a way that has at the very top of that goal or list of goals, human flourishing and liberty and the rule of law, and honoring significantly our police officers as well as the people they serve, Randy Peterson would be the guy to talk to. You could find him on our website. So gentlemen, let me make a two-part conclusion here. The first is really heartfelt gratitude, not just as a colleague of yours, but as a friend. I think that people who've tuned in can see why I love working with both of you. I happen to think it's providential that both of you are on the staff of this organization during this particular time. We've talked about that. I know that Each of us was praying about this conversation because we recognize that we've been given, the Texas Public Policy Foundation has been given a great burden, which is that as an institution of civil society, we can't just sit on the sidelines here and squawk like seems to be the fashion of the day. We want to be right in the middle of diagnosing the problems and solving them. We will charge every hill that is worth it for liberty and freedom and human dignity and flourishing. The two of you have personified, not just today, but in your whole careers, why we do what we do. And so I just want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank
you. The second thing I would say is that it's fashionable, regardless of which political perspective we have, and I know we have folks who've tuned in from across the political spectrum, to point our fingers and say, well, we're going to place the blame for all of this on so-and-so elected official or that elected official. And I don't think the time is now for that. I know that it's an election year. I know that America is more polarized than it's ever been. I know that each of us has our sort of hardwired political positions, and all of that's fine. But now is the time to be Americans before we're political activists. Now is the time to have conversations like this. It's not the time to tear down statues. It's not the time to burn flags. It's not the time to speak ugly about one another. It is time to do what Americans have always done in this beautiful and imperfect land, and that shake hands literally, even amid COVID, and smile and know that we might disagree 20, 30, 60% of the time. We might disagree 100% of the time. That does not give any of us the right to undermine what is our inheritance. Every single one of us, regardless of what we've experienced, regardless where our families are from, how they got to the United States, it is our shared inheritance as Americans to wake up each day and fight for this land, and to do so with the broadest smiles on our faces, because we know that each one of us is privileged to be here. We thank God for that privilege. I thank each of you in the audience for joining us today. You will enjoy the conversation we have next week and the coming weeks. We're not shying away from this topic, because at the root of this topic is the opportunity to solve it. As we know from the great scriptural and historical figure Esther, God created us for a time such as this, and we are missing the opportunity. We're missing our obligation as Americans if we don't. So thank you for joining us. God bless you. God bless Texas, and God bless the wonderful United States of America. Take care.